Most people imagine a downfall as noise, confrontation, exposure, visible defeat. But real shifts don't announce themselves that way. They arrive quietly, almost politely. You notice it in the pause where resistance used to be, in the way attention changes temperature around you. What once felt hostile now feels cautious. What once pushed now hesitates. This is not victory in the dramatic sense. It's something more subtle and far more destabilizing. Because what's collapsing isn't position or power, it's orientation. The moment someone can no longer read you, predict you, or provoke a response, something essential breaks. Fear doesn't surface as panic or aggression. It surfaces as uncertainty, as a growing awareness that your silence isn't empty, it's selective. That your absence isn't weakness, it's withdrawal of validation. Power, at this level, doesn't move forward. It creates space. And in that space, other people begin undoing themselves without realizing why. Control has always depended less on strength than on pattern recognition. Long before authority, before hierarchy, before language itself, survival required the ability to model behavior, to anticipate outcomes, to know with reasonable certainty how something or someone would respond. This instinct never left. It simply evolved. In modern social structures, predictability became the true currency of power, not dominance, but legibility. When people can read you, they can place you. They know how far to push, when to retreat, what tone to use, which version of themselves to present. Your reactions become a map. Your habits become coordinates. Even your boundaries, once understood, become manageable. This is why familiarity feels safe, even when it's dysfunctional. At least it's known. Fear does not emerge when someone opposes you openly. Opposition can be measured. Conflict can be negotiated. Even hostility has structure. What unsettles people is when the structure disappears. When the cues they depended on no longer produce reliable results. When their internal models fail quietly, without warning. Unreadability introduces a specific kind of tension. Not threat, but ambiguity. Not danger, but uncertainty. And the human nervous system has always struggled more with the unknown than with the adversarial. You can prepare for resistance. You cannot prepare for silence that doesn't explain itself. At first, this shift is subtle. You stop reacting in expected ways. You don't escalate where you once did. You don't reassure where reassurance used to come automatically. You don't perform clarity for the comfort of others. Nothing aggressive, nothing performative. Just a refusal to remain transparent on demand. This is where recalibration begins. People who once positioned themselves easily around you begin to hesitate. They replay interactions. They search for signals that are no longer there. They test lightly, then withdraw. Not because you asserted dominance, but because they can no longer predict the cost of misalignment. The absence of data becomes the data. What's happening beneath the surface is not emotional, it's strategic. Human beings are constantly adjusting their behavior relative to others. We track status, mood, intent, leverage. When someone becomes unreadable, that tracking system breaks down. The mind doesn't panic outwardly. It tightens inwardly. It becomes cautious. This is often misinterpreted as intimidation. But intimidation relies on visible threat. Unreadability relies on interpretive collapse. People don't feel overpowered. They feel unanchored. And unanchored systems seek stability. The fear that emerges here is not fear of you, it's fear of miscalculation, of acting on outdated assumptions, of revealing intent to someone who no longer reciprocates transparency. When predictability vanishes, exposure feels risky. Silence becomes safer than engagement. Distance feels like control. What's revealing is how quickly dynamics change without a single word being spoken. Conversations become more formal, jokes soften, challenges disappear. Not because you demanded respect, but because the cost of disrespect can no longer be modeled. The familiar game loses its rules. This is the moment many misunderstand their own position. They assume power requires assertion, visibility, explanation. In reality, power often emerges when explanation stops. When you no longer offer a narrative that others can use to orient themselves around you. Unreadability doesn't mean secrecy. It means non-performance. It's the difference between hiding and not volunteering, between guarding and withholding. The former is defensive, the latter is neutral. And neutrality, in a world addicted to signals, feels destabilizing. Others begin to project. In the absence of clarity, the mind fills the gap. Intentions are imagined, motives are speculated. This projection often reveals more about the observer than the observed. What they fear says less about you and more about how they once used predictability as leverage. This is where internal conflict surfaces quietly, but unmistakably. People realize they can no longer position themselves relative to you. They don't know if they are above, beside, or behind. They don't know which version of themselves will be rewarded. The hierarchy blurs. The social geometry collapses. And so they recalibrate. Some pull away. Some become overly polite. Some attempt to provoke clarity, hoping to restore the old map. Others watch carefully, waiting for consistency to return. Very few confront directly. Because confrontation assumes a stable opponent, unreadability offers none. What's important here is not the reaction of others, but the internal shift that made unreadability possible. This state does not emerge from strategy. It emerges from internal resolution. When you no longer need to be understood in order to feel secure, your behavior naturally simplifies. Responses shorten, explanations fade, emotional leakage decreases. This is not indifference, it's compression. Your internal world becomes less accessible not because you closed it, but because you stopped externalizing it for validation or control. The result is a surface that reflects less and absorbs more. People sense this immediately, even if they can't articulate it. Fear, in this context, is not personal, it's structural. The structure they relied on no longer holds. The predictability that once allowed them to maneuver is gone. And without it, they must either adapt or retreat. Most retreat. Not dramatically, just enough to feel safe again. People like to believe their collapse was delivered by something external. A person, a system. Bad luck, timing. It's more tolerable that way. If the force came from outside, then the self remains intact, innocent, unchanged, still coherent. But most downfalls don't come from impact. They come from drift. From small internal compromises that never trigger alarm because they don't hurt immediately. Identity hardens, curiosity fades, emotional debts pile up quietly. The person remains functional, but no longer responsive. And when pressure eventually arrives, as it always does, there is nothing flexible left to absorb it. This is why collapse often looks sudden to observers and confusing to the person experiencing it. From the inside, it feels undeserved. From the outside, it looks inevitable. The erosion wasn't dramatic enough to notice day by day, but it was consistent. The self stopped updating. Old narratives stayed in place long after they stopped matching reality. Stability was simulated, not maintained. When the structure finally gives way, the mind searches for an external cause because accepting internal decay would require confronting how long the neglect lasted. Karma is often misunderstood because people frame it as moral punishment, as if the world is keeping score and striking back. That framing misses something quieter and more precise. What returns to people isn't judgment. It's consequence, delayed, psychological, and deeply personal. Unresolved identities don't disappear. They turn inward. Suppressed contradictions don't dissolve. They accumulate. Every avoided truth becomes stored tension. Over time, the mind becomes crowded with unfinished business, and behavior starts compensating for that weight. Defensiveness increases, perception narrows, reactions intensify. Eventually, the person becomes the source of the pressure they keep attributing to the world. This is where conflict with others often gets misread. When you stop stabilizing someone emotionally, psychologically, structurally, their instability becomes visible. Not because you caused it, but because you were unknowingly absorbing it. Some people mistake that moment for betrayal. Others call it abandonment. But underneath, what's happening is simpler and harder to accept. The system they relied on to remain coherent is no longer buffering their internal disorder. And without that external support, the unresolved self begins to collapse under its own weight. This is why you don't actually defeat people in the way stories suggest. There is rarely a decisive blow. What happens instead is outlasting. You remain intact long enough for their internal contradictions to surface. You stay grounded while their identity continues operating on outdated assumptions. Over time, they begin reacting to realities that no longer exist, fighting battles that are no longer being fought. Their behavior grows erratic not because they are attacked, but because the internal structure they depended on has expired. The unsettling realization comes when you see that none of this required malice, strategy, or confrontation. No one had to be pushed. No one had to be exposed. The collapse was already in motion. You simply stopped participating in its maintenance. And once that happens, the process accelerates on its own. Silence is not passive. It is an environment. When you remove your response, you remove the structure that allows others to stabilize their inner narratives. Most interactions are not about communication. They are about regulation. People speak, provoke, question, or perform in order to locate themselves emotionally. Your reaction becomes their reference point. When that reference disappears, the mind begins searching for something else to hold on to, and often finds nothing but its own unfinished thoughts. In that vacuum, unresolved guilt becomes louder. Envy loses its disguise. Fixation, once masked as interest or concern, reveals its true shape. Without your engagement, there is no distraction from the internal noise they were avoiding. Silence does not accuse. It does not explain. It simply refuses to carry what was never yours to hold. And that refusal quietly redirects the weight back to where it originated. This is why silence feels threatening to some. Not because it is aggressive, but because it is neutral. It offers no friction, no validation, no opposition. Without resistance, their story cannot progress. Narratives require an audience. Conflict requires participation. When you step out of the role assigned to you, the script collapses. What remains is not clarity but exposure. The mind, suddenly without an external target, begins replaying its own contradictions. Attention, when it can no longer be projected outward, turns inward by force. Not gently, not voluntarily. It circles familiar patterns, looking for justification, coherence, meaning, and often finds gaps. Silence does not create this discomfort. It reveals it. It shows what was already unstable, already unresolved, already waiting beneath the surface. The discomfort is not caused by the quiet. It is caused by what the quiet makes impossible to ignore. Over time, this shift becomes undeniable. Without your responses to react against, their emotional energy has nowhere to travel. It collapses inward. The urgency fades. The fixation weakens. The need to be seen, validated, or resisted begins to unravel. Not because you did anything, but because you stopped doing what kept their internal tension externalized. Silence, in this way, becomes a mirror that does not distort or explain. It simply reflects, and that reflection is often unbearable, because facing oneself requires coherence. It requires owning contradictions instead of projecting them. It requires sitting with unanswered questions instead of exporting them into conflict. Silence does not demand this reckoning. It just removes the exits. What happens next is not under your control and never was. Power, in its most mature form, never needs to announce itself. It does not push. It does not persuade. It does not explain. Instead, it alters the environment indirectly, the way gravity bends movement without ever touching what it pulls. You see it in the smallest adjustments. A softened tone where bluntness once lived. A delayed response where immediacy used to be natural. A careful choice of words where spontaneity once flowed. These changes are rarely conscious. People don't sit down and decide to be cautious around you. Their nervous system does it for them. Something registers an unknown variable, and the mind adapts before language catches up. What's happening beneath the surface is not respect in the traditional sense, and not fear in the dramatic sense. It's calculation. When someone can no longer predict how you will react, or what you require from them emotionally, they begin to manage themselves preemptively. They reduce exposure. They hedge statements. They leave margins for safety. This is the quiet mathematics of power. Not control through force, but influence through uncertainty. You are no longer responding in ways that confirm their expectations, and that absence destabilizes the familiar pattern they relied on. At this point, something fundamental shifts. You are no longer fully inside the social exchange. You're not competing for approval, alignment, or dominance. You've stepped just far enough back that others must now account for you rather than engage you directly. You become a variable in their internal equation, something to consider, not something to manage. And that position is deeply unsettling to people who are used to reading emotional signals, extracting reassurance, or predicting outcomes. When those signals disappear, imagination fills the gap. And imagination is always more powerful than reality. What unsettles them is not any single action you take. It's the realization that you no longer need to perform. You're not rushing to clarify misunderstandings. You're not correcting perceptions. You're not offering emotional transparency to stabilize the room. That withdrawal isn't coldness, it's containment. And containment changes the rules. When you no longer seek to be understood, others begin working harder to understand you, usually without ever admitting it, even to themselves. This is why real power often feels invisible from the inside. You don't feel larger. You don't feel elevated. If anything, you feel quieter, more settled. less reactive. The external effects appear elsewhere in how others behave when you're not speaking, in what they choose not to say, in the tension that arises not from conflict but from restraint. They are editing themselves not because you are watching closely, but because they sense you are no longer dependent on their validation, their response, or their permission. And beneath all of it lies the most unsettling realization of all. What changes people is not what you do, but what you no longer need. The moment you stop needing approval, explanation, or emotional alignment, you step outside the familiar hierarchy. You don't rise above it. You simply exit its logic. And from that distance, without effort or display, your presence begins to shape behavior on its own, quietly, inevitably. There is nothing dramatic about this ending, no climax, no revelation spoken aloud, just the stillness that settles where noise used to be. The understanding that power was never something to be asserted, only something that becomes visible when you stop reaching for it.